I was standing under the old oak tree on my family's ranch, watching the last few rows of white chairs get filled with friends and neighbors, when I saw her Barbara. HOA board president, neighborhood busybody, and all-around menace in a lemon-colored pantsuit that looked like it had been ironed with rage. I knew she'd show up. The second the wedding invites were delivered, she dropped a typed letter in my mailbox citing some nonsense about unauthorized gatherings exceeding HOA noise ordinances. Never mind that the ranches outside city limits technically made the HOA's jurisdiction laughably thin out here. She didn't care. Barbara wasn't just any HOA president, she was the kind who thought her clipboard gave her federal power. "Michael," my soon-to-be wife Zariah said, gently tugging on my sleeve. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just spotted a wasp." Zariah glanced over her shoulder, caught sight of Barbara, and rolled her eyes. "She's not gonna ruin this. She's gonna try." The ceremony was seconds from starting. My best man, my brother, gave me a nod. Zariah's little niece scattered flower petals down the aisle. The sun was golden, the breeze perfect, and I was about to marry the woman I loved in front of everyone who mattered. Then I heard it, the unmistakable wail of sirens. I turned just in time to see a sheriff's cruiser roll up the dirt path. Behind it, another, and then a third. The crowd started murmuring. Barbara was already marching toward the cars like she'd summoned the cavalry, waving her HOA binder in the air like it was a badge. "Unlawful event," she barked to the first deputy who stepped out. "This wedding is in violation of Article 4, Section 2 noise, unauthorized gatherings and non-compliant parking on agricultural property. I want citations issued, immediately." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to calm down." "Oh, I'm calm," Barbara snapped. "I'm a board president. I know the law." That's when the back door of the third cruiser opened and out stepped the groom, me, Sheriff Matthew Archer. I walked up behind Barbara just as she was demanding to speak to someone in charge. "Hi, Barbara," I said, adjusting my dress uniform. "I believe you already met the sheriff." She spun around, her face going pale as chalk. "You can't be, I can be," I said, "and I am." Zariah came up beside me, her hand in mine, trying not to laugh. The deputies tried even harder. Barbara's mouth opened and shut like a fish on dry land. You can't officiate your own wedding." "I'm not officiating," I said. "That's Reverend Connolly. I'm just marrying the love of my life on my own land, as is my legal right." But the HOA has no authority out here," I finished. "We're outside the jurisdiction. And even if we weren't, this isn't a commercial event, it's a private family gathering. I've got permits, I've got parking plans, I've even got a noise waiver signed by the county." I held up the thick folder I'd kept tucked in my jacket pocket. "You know, just in case someone tried to crash the party." Barbara's eyes darted to the crowd, now dead silent and watching every second of the showdown. "You called the police on a wedding," I said, "and you lied to dispatch about a noise disturbance. That's a misuse of emergency services." Barbara took a step back. I didn't lie, I heard music." "There's no music yet," I replied. "We haven't even started." The crowd erupted into quiet laughter. One of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're gonna need you to come with us." "You made a false report to 911. "What? No, I'm the victim here," she shouted, backing away. "You're not a victim," Zariah said, her voice calm but firm. "You're a control freak who can't stand not getting her way. You tried to shut down my wedding with a lie," I added. "But here's the thing, Barbara, this community's done with you." And just like that, the guests started clapping. Barbara didn't walk away, she stormed off, heels stabbing into the dirt like she could punish the ground for betraying her. The deputies didn't cuff her. Not yet. But Deputy Lomas let her know an official statement would be required, and that fabricating emergency calls was being formally investigated. She didn't respond, just disappeared behind the row of parked trucks at the edge of the field, muttering to herself. We got married right after that. No interruptions, no more theatrics. Reverend Connolly kept it short and warm, and when I kissed Zariah, the whole crowd stood up. I didn't see Barbara again until after the cake was cut. "You're not gonna believe this," my brother muttered, coming up behind me as I helped an elderly neighbor into her car. "Check your phone." I pulled it from my jacket pocket. 4 missed calls from dispatch, 2 messages, 1 video attachment. I opened it and there she was. Barbara, standing at the gates of her subdivision, filming herself on her phone like she was breaking a national scandal. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice snapping with fake urgency. "The sheriff of this county is using his status to host an illegal event. The noise is out of control, the traffic has blocked the road, and I have reason to believe alcohol is being served without proper licensing. This is a violation of several county ordinances. I demand an emergency inspection. I demand accountability." She panned the camera toward the ranch, our string lights glowing in the twilight, kids chasing each other with cupcakes, people laughing and dancing near the barn. "Did she send this to the news?" I asked. "No idea," my brother said. "But someone forwarded it to dispatch, and now the chief wants to talk." I called him back under the cover of a cottonwood tree. "She's lost it," I said before he could speak. "We've got everything documented, licenses, permits, all clean." "I know," Chief Ramirez replied. "That's not the issue. She tried filing a public ethics complaint against you and the department, claimed you manipulated the county into approving your own permits. She's reaching. She's not just reaching, she's throwing punches in the dark, and she filed it under her HOA's name." That caught me off guard. "She did what?" She submitted the paperwork using her board title, claimed the HOA collectively objects to your conduct and demands disciplinary action. Said you've created a hostile environment for community oversight. I looked out at the ranch. My uncle was slow dancing with his wife. Zariah's dad was arm wrestling one of my deputies at a picnic table. Half those people were HOA members, none of them looked hostile. "She didn't clear this with the board," I said. "Already confirmed," Ramirez replied. "One of her own board members called me directly. Said they had no idea she was pulling this stunt." That changed everything. Filing a complaint under an organizational name without board approval, that wasn't just petty, that was fraud. "I'll handle it," I said. "I was hoping you'd say that." I hung up and found Zariah near the fire pit, barefoot and laughing with her cousins. I pulled her aside. "That woman just used her HOA to file an ethics complaint against me, without board approval." Zariah's expression didn't change, just a slight tilt of the head. "So we go to the board," she said. "Let them know what she's done, force them to vote on it publicly." "I'm thinking the same, but I want to do it right. No surprises, no shortcuts," she nodded. "I'll make calls tomorrow. A few of them are friends of my mom. They'll listen." The next morning, we didn't waste time. While the rest of the family packed up leftovers and folded chairs, I drove into town and stopped by the county records office. I requested every filing Barbara had made on behalf of the HOA over the last year. There were more than I expected. Some of them were just routine nonsense: permit denials, noise complaints, generic letters to the zoning commission. But 2 were different. One was the complaint she'd filed against me. The other was a formal letter to the treasurer of the HOA's account, requesting a budget reallocation for private legal consultation. That was the one that mattered. She was funneling HOA money toward a lawyer. No board vote, no approval, just her signature. I met with the board that evening. Zariah's mom had arranged it at the community center. 7 members showed. All of them looked tired. One of them, Greg, a retired math teacher, had brought a thick binder full of printed emails. "She's been pushing us to approve new bylaws for months," he said, flipping pages. "Wants to expand the HOA's jurisdiction by claiming associated parcels like your ranch." "Can't happen," I said. "We're outside the plotted boundary, always have been." "She thinks she can reclassify the land as a buffer zone and force it into compliance." "She can't. That would take a zoning override from the county council, and I'd know I sit in on those meetings." "She's not listening to anyone," another board member said. "She's hijacking the budget and making threats." I laid the two documents on the table, the ethics complaint and the budget reallocation. "She's not just making threats," I said. "She's committing fraud." For a moment, no one said anything. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. Then Greg stood. "I motion to suspend Barbara until a vote can be held." "I second that," said a woman near the end of the table. The vote was unanimous. They agreed to call a special session open to the community. I offered to step back from the process, but they insisted I attend, not as sheriff, as a resident. 2 days later, the session was held in the same community center. Over 70 people showed. Barbara arrived late, sunglasses on, lips pressed in a line. She looked around like the room owed her an apology. When her name was called, she stepped forward like she was giving a campaign speech. "I have only ever acted in the best interest of this neighborhood," she said. "My efforts to maintain order have been twisted by those who resent accountability. If that makes me unpopular, then so be it. I serve the rules." "You don't serve the rules," Greg said, standing beside me. "You serve yourself. You spent HOA money without a vote. You filed legal documents in our name without consent. That's not leadership, that's misconduct." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said, stepping forward. "This is accountability." I handed copies of the county filings to the board secretary. The room murmured as they were passed around. The treasurer confirmed no vote had ever been taken for legal expenses. The board confirmed no consensus was given for the ethics complaint. Multiple residents stood to speak, some angry, some just disappointed. Barbara tried to interrupt each one. The board president, appointed only weeks earlier when the previous resigned, finally called for order. "We will now vote on permanent removal from board leadership." No one needed to ask for clarification. The result was 6-0. Barbara didn't wait for the final count. She stormed out, sunglasses still on, mumbling something about lawsuits. She never filed one. The new board audited the HOA budget the following week. They found over $2,000 missing, used on private consultations and printing fees for false claims. When the county reviewed the documents, they flagged 2 for potential legal violations. The district attorney opened a formal inquiry. Barbara resigned from the HOA entirely before charges were filed. She sold her house 6 weeks later. Word got around fast. Not just in our neighborhood, but across the county. People started attending their HOA meetings again. Some even ran for board seats themselves. The culture shifted. Zariah and I went back to our normal routine. Ranch work, town meetings, quiet weekends. But every so often, someone would stop me in the grocery store or wave from across the diner. "Hey, Sheriff," they'd say. "Heard about the wedding. Hell of a way to make a point." 2 months after Barbara disappeared from the neighborhood scene, the community was finally breathing again. The board had turned over almost entirely. HOA meetings were no longer secretive, and people actually showed up without dreading the outcome. But right when things felt settled, a letter arrived at my department that cracked everything wide open again. It was addressed to the Internal Affairs Division, but forwarded to me because of the return address Dawson Legal Group, a firm known mostly for handling probate cases and the occasional farm inheritance dispute. It wasn't the kind of office you'd expect to be mixed up in HOA drama. Inside the envelope was a single-page statement from a junior associate who'd been working under Barbara's private consultation retainer. According to him, she'd requested that he draft a quiet claim deed for an adjacent parcel land that wasn't part of the HOA, but sat between the main subdivision and my family's ranch. The associate had grown uneasy when Barbara asked him to backdate the document and remove the original owner's name. That owner, my neighbor, Mr. Amador, an 86-year-old veteran who'd lived there since the Eisenhower administration. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. The clerk, Melanie, didn't even need to be asked twice. She tried to file this in person, she told me, flipping through a locked drawer and pulling out a flagged folder. But it didn't pass the verification check. The signature didn't match our ledger. We marked it for review. The name on the deed was forged, plain and simple. And worse, it had my ranch's parcel listed as an easement extension, which would have made us legally obligated to share access. If it had gone through unnoticed, Barbara could have argued that the HOA had a legal claim to enforce jurisdiction over my property. I pulled out my phone and called the district attorney. "Tom, we've got something new. Possible real estate fraud, attempted land annexation, and a forged signature on a county deed." There was a long pause. Was this connected to the prior ethics complaint fallout? Same name, same motive. Different crime. By the end of the week, the investigation was reopened. Not just into her misuse of HOA funds, but into what now looked like a coordinated effort to seize land by manipulating public records. The DA's office called in a forensic document examiner, and I tracked down Mr. Amador, who was living with his daughter in a neighboring town after a recent fall. When I showed him the document, he stared at it for a full minute before shaking his head. "I never signed this. I never agreed to anything like this." "Did she ever contact you about selling?" she asked me once last winter. "Told me the HOA wanted to beautify the corridor between the subdivision and your ranch. I told her the only thing that needed beautifying was her attitude." Mr. Amador agreed to give a formal statement. His daughter, a paralegal, accompanied him to the deposition. She brought along dated utility bills and notarized letters, showing he'd maintained the property without interruption for over 40 years. Meanwhile, Zariah uncovered something just as damning. She'd been helping the new HOA treasurer digitize old records when she came across an encrypted spreadsheet labeled Phase 2, Integration Planning. It was password protected, but the file metadata showed it had been last modified 3 weeks before Barbara was removed. She handed it to me with a look I hadn't seen since our academy days. This wasn't just about your wedding. She was laying groundwork for a hostile expansion. We got a court order to access the contents. Inside were detailed notes about targeting 5 properties: mine, Amador's, and 3 others on the perimeter of the subdivision. Her strategy had been to pressure owners with escalating code violations, then manipulate legal filings to fold them into the HOA boundaries. She'd even listed potential loyalists within the county office who might be sympathetic to her cause. The DA added conspiracy to commit fraud to her charges. By then, Barbara had already fled the state. She'd quietly moved to Arizona and was living with a cousin under a different surname. But she hadn't covered her tracks well. One of my deputies, Jamie, tracked her down through her vehicle registration. The same lemon-colored sedan she'd driven to my wedding had been re-registered under her maiden name. The arrest warrant was signed by a judge who'd once fined her for harassing county surveyors. No one shed a tear when the U.S. Marshals picked her up outside a strip mall nail salon. Her arraignment drew a crowd. Not because people wanted revenge, but because they wanted to see accountability stick. The courtroom was packed with residents who'd once avoided HOA meetings like the plague. Mr. Amador sat in the front row, his daughter beside him, holding his hand. Barbara tried to represent herself. The judge shut that down immediately. "You are facing multiple felony charges," he said, not unkindly. "This is not a traffic court. You will require counsel." She was assigned a public defender. During the preliminary hearing, the prosecutor laid out the timeline: misuse of HOA funds, falsified legal filings, attempted land theft, and impersonation of HOA board authority. The judge denied bail, citing risk of flight. On the way out, Barbara locked eyes with me. "This is personal," she hissed. "No," I said calmly. "This is legal." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Her defense tried to argue she'd been misled by her legal advisor. But the junior associate from Dawson Legal testified under oath, clearly explaining how she'd insisted on pushing the deed through even after being warned of its illegality. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty on all charges. Her sentence: 4 years of probation, 18 months in county jail, and a lifetime ban from holding any position of fiduciary responsibility within a homeowners association. She was also ordered to repay over $25,000 in legal and administrative costs that the HOA had incurred cleaning up her mess. But the real victory wasn't the conviction. It was what came after. The subdivision, once fractured and paranoid, had pulled together like I'd never seen. They held a community festival on the same field where Zariah and I were married. Kids ran three-legged races, the church choir sang under the old oak tree, and someone even brought a barbecue smoker the size of a horse trailer. At the festival, Greg handed me a wooden plaque. On it, burned into the grain, were the words, "Integrity is louder than authority." "I didn't earn this," I said. "You didn't have to," he replied. "You just didn't flinch when it mattered." Zariah and I stood near the fire pit again that night, watching the stars come out over the ridge. The same land Barbara had tried to steal through deception now belonged to the people who'd always respected it. Mr. Amador had made arrangements to leave his parcel to a Veterans Assistance Program, ensuring it'd never be touched by another HOA scheme again. As we walked back toward the house in the quiet, my radio buzzed gently on my hip. I glanced at it, then turned it off. "Everything all right?" Zariah asked. "Better than all right," I said. It's finally quiet. 3 weeks passed after Barbara's conviction, and the county's legal machinery finally began to slow. Zariah and I were back to early mornings and late evenings on the ranch fencing repairs, livestock rotations, and the occasional visit from a neighbor asking advice about a property dispute or zoning concern. Apparently, once folks realized I'd cleaned up my own backyard, they figured I could help with theirs too. One of those neighbors was Marvin Kessler, a quiet man in his 70s who owned a small pecan orchard just past the West Ridge. He'd always kept to himself, but he showed up in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon with a cardboard shoebox and an expression like he'd just stepped off a sinking ship. "I know you've had your hands full," he said, setting the box down on my porch table. "But I think there's something you need to see." Inside were folded maps, handwritten notes, and printed emails. I flipped through them slowly, catching dates and keywords that made my stomach tighten. Acquisition plan, eminent domain, phase 3. "These are notes from Barbara?" I asked. "Not just hers," Marvin replied. "I found these taped under the drawers of the old HOA filing cabinet. I bought it secondhand after the association cleared out their office. Figured I'd use it for tool receipts." But this was all tucked inside. Zariah leaned over my shoulder, scanning the top sheet. She had another expansion plan. "No," I said, my voice low. "She had a takeover." The documents outlined a proposed reclassification of 15 properties surrounding the subdivision. Not just an annexation plan, this was a coordinated effort to manipulate county records and initiate forced compliance through falsified code violations. Barbara had intended to trigger a procedural loophole. If enough parcels were deemed abandoned or non-compliant, the HOA could petition the county for emergency jurisdiction to restore order and property value. "She was going to declare us a blight zone," Zariah said, jaw tightening, "and make herself the solution." "Look at this," I added, holding up a typed letter addressed to the County Housing Commission. It was unsigned, but the language matched Barbara's perfectly references to neighborhood continuity, visual integrity, and unified governance. The plan had been drafted but never mailed. We brought the entire box to the county attorney's office. They confirmed the parcel numbers and cross-checked the zoning applications. 3 of the properties on the list had already received anonymous complaints to the Fire Safety Board, one of which had triggered a mandatory inspection. The trail was still warm, but then something stranger happened. One of the emails, printed from a now-defunct address, referenced a name we hadn't seen before, Delaney Trust Holdings. I called in a favor from one of our financial crimes investigators, Officer Chalat. She ran the name through the state's corporate registry. It was a shell entity based out of a strip mall in San Marcos, with no listed employees and a single mailbox rental as its headquarters. But its corporate agent, one of Barbara's former business school classmates. We dug deeper. Turns out, Barbara had planned to sell the disputed parcels once acquired through fraudulent means to this holding company. From there, they'd be rezoned and leased for commercial development. She wasn't just trying to control the neighborhood, she was trying to flip it, the estimated profit. Over $2 million. We took it straight to the district attorney. He convened a grand jury within 5 days. The charges went from fraud and forgery to racketeering, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property through shell corporations. Barbara, already in custody for her earlier conviction, was blindsided by the new indictment. Her public defender requested an emergency hearing. I attended not as sheriff, but as a witness. The courtroom was filled again, this time with landowners from every corner of the county. They came with property maps, maintenance logs, and receipts showing decades of uninterrupted ownership. One woman, a single mother who owned a goat farm near the eastern boundary, brought her teenage son and presented a notarized letter from her grandfather, who'd homesteaded the land in the 50s. Barbara sat at the defense table, handcuffed, eyes darting across the room. She no longer wore designer pantsuits or heavy perfume. Just a standard orange jumpsuit and the brittle silence of someone realizing the walls were finally closing in. The prosecutor laid out the full scope of her scheme. She'd used false complaints to trigger fines, then offered to help property owners by buying them out through a third party she secretly controlled. She'd forged meeting minutes from non-existent board votes, filed fake inspection reports, and even altered digital timestamps on zoning applications. The judge didn't hesitate. Bail was denied again. Her trial was scheduled for early spring, but it didn't get that far, facing overwhelming evidence and a potential sentence exceeding 20 years. Barbara accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to 6 felony counts, agreed to testify against her co-conspirators, and forfeited all financial interest in Delaney Trust Holdings. She was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, with the first 3 served without parole. After the sentencing, the county commission passed a new ordinance tightening the rules for HOA jurisdiction and requiring quarterly audits of all associations with more than 50 members. The legislation was named the Amador Act in honor of the veteran whose forged deed had set everything in motion. Zariah and I attended the signing ceremony. The mayor shook our hands and thanked us for restoring faith in private property rights. I didn't say much in return. The victory was real but heavy. That night back at the ranch, we sat on the porch as a warm wind drifted in from the west. The cicadas were out. The sky was clear. Faint laughter echoed from the neighbor's yard. Their daughter was graduating, and they'd set up string lights and folding chairs, just like we had. Zariah leaned back in her chair, glass of iced tea in hand. "You think it's over?" she asked. I looked out at the fields, the fence lines, the barn in silhouette. "For us? Yeah," I said. "But for her, I think prison's just the start." A county truck pulled down the road, headlights sweeping across the gravel. It paused in front of our gate, then rolled on. Routine patrol, nothing urgent. Zariah reached out and took my hand. "Next time we throw a party," she said, "let's keep it under 100 guests." "Deal," I said, "but I'm still checking permits." She laughed, and for the first time in months it didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like peace. Barbara's house was auctioned off 6 weeks later. The proceeds went toward restitution for the affected homeowners. The new occupant, a retired firefighter, and his wife planted native wildflowers in the front yard. They removed the surveillance cameras Barbara had installed and tore down the 6-foot privacy wall she'd used to block her neighbor's garden from view. The HOA board, now under new leadership, voted to reduce annual dues, eliminate unnecessary fines, and cap the president's term at 1 year. They also passed a rule requiring that all complaints be filed in person, not anonymously and not by phone. Barbara's name was never mentioned again at the meetings. But the brass plaque that hung in the community center lobby, the one she'd installed herself, etched with her name, was quietly taken down and replaced. It now reads, "This space belongs to the people, not the power."